Hey everyone, Richard Tubb here. Now, a few weeks ago over on my Tubb Talk podcast for IT consultants, we interviewed Steve Petryshuck of Auvik Networks. I asked Steve at the time, we were talking and describing the tool. I was like, it'd be really good if we can get a visual of what the Auvik tools looks like. So I've invited Steve back to join us, and he's going to give us a video demo today. Steve, great to see you again. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me again today, Richard. It's great to be speaking again. This time a little bit more about Auvik itself. So.
Indeed, yeah. So for anybody, if we start off, for anybody not familiar with Auvik, how would you describe what the tool does?
Yeah, so the highest level overview is we're cloud-based network management. So helping MSPs and IT teams around the world get a handle on the networks that they manage. Doing things like performance monitoring, network mapping, configuration management.
Excellent. So for anybody who's not seen the tool, can we jump in and maybe have a look at things?
For sure. Yeah, you bet. Why don't we go ahead and get the screen share started here?
Cool.
If it's all right, maybe before we dive in, I was maybe just looking to highlight just a couple of quick things before we dive in, just sort of set the stage to remind everyone why we're here. Is that
absolutely? That would be really useful. Thank you.
So yeah, as we dive in, I've mentioned cloud-based network management, but we're sort of faced with this new reality that the world has become distributed, and it's probably no secret to anyone, right? Richard, you're sitting in your home office, which I think you were before the pandemic anyway. But here I am, stuck in my home office. We're all more distributed. We're all working remotely, but we're all connecting to these SaaS applications that allow us to do our work. But what we have to remember is that what's connecting me from this piece of glass in front of me to the outside world, to whatever application I'm using, there's a bunch of networks that underlay that. And some networks are my home network. Some networks are the networks that you manage. Some networks are the ISP networks. But ultimately, it's this network. The networks are this glue that holds sort of everything together. And so, what we have to do is make sure that we focus some time on managing this network infrastructure, because we need to make sure that this underlying utility now is performing well for all of our users. And so that's where we help, right? That's where Auvik really dives in. And we do it sort of in a few different ways. First is, by adding efficiency. As a cloud-based network management, we really focus on out-of-the-box experience. We help automate what we can, repetitive tasks like inventorying, which we'll dive into in a bit. We're doing that automated discovery, so helping you know exactly what's out there on your network, what it is you need to protect, what it is you need to see, getting alerting for rapid response. So that's sort of another key pillar. And then just giving you visibility. What I love to say here is it's all about context, right? When you get a troubleshooting, hey, the network's slow, the internet's slow, what do I do about it? We need to give you context to help to solve that problem. And so with Auvik, we have that immediate context, that immediate visibility, so that you can start to increase your confidence in restoring the network quickly when it does go down and preventing it from going down in the first place. So that's sort of setting the stage. I'm happy to sort of dive in. And what I was thinking we could do today to sort of really bring us through it is start by doing a bit of a deployment. Because I said, hey, it's ease of use, that out-of-the-box experience. Let's do a deployment. Let's watch Auvik discover a network and sort of talk through it as we're doing that.
Absolutely. Let's show people the power of this tool and just go through it, because seeing is believing.
For sure. So logged in here to my Auvik dashboard. I'm going to go ahead and add a site in here. We're just going to add in a name. We'll call it... We'll be very descriptive with our naming conventions here. But this is basically just setting up what we call sort of a site within the Auvik platform. So we are a multi-tenanted tool, meaning that especially for MSPs, you have multiple clients that you need to manage, right? Or if you're a corporate IT shop, you have multiple locations. And so we have this site concept to allow me to create independent buckets for each one of these different organizations that I manage. So what we're basically doing is setting up an independent site here, so that everything we do to discover this network and all the alerting and mapping and inventory for this specific site is all self-contained. So really the key differentiator there being cloud-based and multi-tenanted.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and install this Windows collector. Now I've already done the download, but what is going to be important is this API key for me here. I'm just going to come over to my Windows server where I've got my Auvik installer already going here.
And in terms of, if I jump in just while we're doing that, in terms of what you can install on what hardware, what software, what does that look like?
So there's plenty of options. We support Windows-based devices for an Auvik service. So that's either a Windows server or workstation. Doesn't need to be top of line brand new, as long as it's supported Windows and it still runs. We have people using old laptops. We have people going out and buying new equipment. It's also You can use dedicated virtual appliance or dedicated physical appliance. So if you wanted to run it on an Ubuntu server, or if you have a VMware host, you can deploy it on there as well. We have also partners who go out and buy little, whether it's an Intel NUC or other micro PCs to help run that collector as well.
Yeah.
So the choice is yours, as they say.
We are on a Windows Server setup at the moment as we're doing this.
Yes, I actually believe this is desktop version, if I recall correctly, but it's.
Okay. But the experience will be the same.
Experience is the same. Yep. So see, I just connected to the Auvik system. It's deploying the collector. It's more or less hands off at this point. And actually, I'm now done on the server itself. So now that I've entered in the credentials, the collector is installing. Now that we're finished, we're done. And if I come back to the Auvik dashboard here, all the way back across. In a second, the collector will connect back in and we'll see this screen disappear. There we go. And discovery will have already started.
Brilliant. So the point here is we don't need to keep going back to the server, the workstation, wherever we got it installed. Once you've got it installed, it's done, and everything else is done in the cloud from the desktop here.
Exactly. Everything else is done here through the cloud UI. So what we basically have here is we have the system starting to connect back in. And start to discover that first subnet that it's deployed on. So you can see here, I've created my account, I've added in a first site, I've installed that collector as we sort of walk through all these steps. And now it's scanning that first subnet that it's deployed on. In this case, I think it's a 10.10.10 network. It's a /24. So it's going to go out and crawl that entire network and find all the hosts on it. So I don't want to necessarily sit here and watch this paint dry, if you will, but this should take about 3 to 5 minutes. Why don't we dive into a fully set up site? We can keep sort of the dialogue going, and then we can come back to this in a few minutes.
Go for it.
Awesome. So as we this is a fully deployed site. It's one of our lab environments here at Auvik. And this is sort of the first deliverable that you as a user of Auvik is going to see is this network topology map. So I noticed you give a bit of a smirk there, Richard. What's your first reaction when you see the topology map? So
you know me, Steve. I'm a massive geek and I love this sort of stuff. So my first idea here is, wow, you can see a lot of different equipment. One of the questions I was going to ask is, what can we expect to see catalogued by Auvik? But I suspect you're going to walk us through that now.
For sure, yeah. Basically, anything with an IP address is on the network is something we're going to find. Once we discover that device, the important thing is that we start to discover the connections back to the network infrastructure. So I don't just stop at saying, hey, here's a device on the network, it's on this specific subnet. We're going to show you what port on what switch or what access point that device is actually hooked into. So I mentioned earlier, I referred to that troubleshooting process. Think about if I get a call from someone trying to use this printer, one of these printers as an example, and they're having problems, and I need to go track it down, I need to find it. I can see exactly where it's connected back in. I know exactly how that interface is performing. I can dive directly into that, but it's that context, right? I have this network topology map showing me exactly where every single endpoint on my network is connected back in.
And I noticed earlier on, Steve, forgive me for jumping in. So Auvik is doing this via SNMP, the discovery process. Is that correct?
So there's a number of different protocols we use to do the discovery. SNMP is absolutely one of them. So if we sort of start at the beginning, it's a ping out to the devices. Then we do a deep dive using things like SNMP or WMI for Windows devices. We use broadcast protocols like UPnP and Windows SMB, the Bonjour protocol to start to classify assets. And then we read a bunch of details over SNMP, as well as access the command line on core network devices, which we'll dive into in a little bit. But one of our differentiators is that we've actually built a lot of for lack of a better word, screen scraping or CLI scraping, where we'll run a command and then look for specific outputs to help us build that database, which is where a lot of network management platforms sort of stop short.
That makes sense. And the reason I ask that is, at no point here have I seen you put things like SNMP credentials in or Windows domain credentials. Is that necessary, or is that a later step that comes into play, or is it needed at all?
So it is needed. You'll see these across the top here. We see that there's prompts telling me, hey, I have devices that may need credentials to be added in. So as part of that discovery process, it's going to ask for credentials where they're needed. If we've already put them in, or if there's something defaults like public or private, we'll try those defaults. If you do find some of the defaults, maybe it's time to change those around as we're sort of all seeing security events come to light every now and then. So we will prompt you to say, hey, add in some credentials, but it's something that is, if you wanted to add them in up front, you can, but we'll prompt you as we discover devices that need them.
Got it. But if somebody wanted literally to jump in here, they were like me, eager, wanted to see what it can do, no credentials required, just literally download the installer, kick it off, and it's going to start to discover things.
And it's going to start to discover things. And you'd be surprised how often there are things that you find that you didn't know were on the network. You'll be often or surprised at how often you find the default credentials actually working. So.
Yeah, I can imagine. And, the other thing that sprung to mind here is the amount of perhaps rogue devices, for want of a better word, that just sort of sneak onto networks that MSPs and indeed clients are not aware of.
For sure. Yeah, I don't want to slap a percentage on it, but I've done hundreds, if not thousands, of these deployments, and most of the time it's I didn't know that was on the network. So.
I can well imagine, yeah.
So just to sort of reinforce a couple of points on the map here, one thing that I'd like to sort of highlight is that beyond just the physical topology showing me what port things are connected into, I can actually start to overlay logical topologies as well. So it's pretty common in networking to have different versions of topology diagrams, depending on what you want to see or what level of detail you want to go in. With our topology diagram that's interactive, you're able to actually, remove some of those manual steps, because we have the ability to sort of manipulate this map. And in this case, I'm just highlighting all the devices on this VLAN 70 on this lab subnet. So I'm able to sort of, narrow in on just specific segments of the network without having to go out and recreate a new map. So it's easy to drill in and interact with different facets of the map. So let's do a quick check back on how things are going in the discovery here. Where I went the wrong way. Let's just go up here. So it looks like we found a device, a potential routing device here at 10.10.10.1 in my network. It was able to connect to it using default SNMP credentials. Okay, so that's not great in this network, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and click map my network. And we can see that things have started to come together already, at least from a asset discovery standpoint. So we're finding some devices. I have some host names on some devices as the discovery is starting to come together. And just a quick time check. I think it's been about 5 minutes or so since we got this collector deployed, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll see this start to come back and continue to grow here over time.
So this would have been a router or a managed switch that it's found and then just explored from there.
Yeah, so it basically discovered this specific asset, which we can see that it's got this green check mark for SNMP, which means we're already talking to it. We're just sort of, for lack of a better word, interrogating that device. It sounds evil, but it's not. It's saying, hey, tell me about your host name, tell me about your system object identifier, tell me what interfaces you have, tell me what your CDP or LDP tables look like all these different discovery details. And so that's all happening behind the scenes. You don't have to come in and say, hey, use these MIBs or apply this discovery service to this device. We're just, based on what we discover about what kind of make and model it is, we'll then automatically go through and do those sort of ask those questions.
So super quick and easy to get up and running, I think, is the first thing I take from this.
Yep, absolutely. So jumping back into the map here, I'm going to dive down into a specific device because I really want to highlight some of the information we actually collect about devices as we are still discovering that other network. So here on this network, we're looking at an ASA firewall, and just quickly looking at this first tile on the left-hand side, we're seeing everything from make and model, serial number, subnets, firmware versions. For some devices, we're even going to go as far as suggesting an update or an upgrade to the software version if that's available. And as well, looking at device vendor lifecycle information. So is this device no longer for sale? Is it out of support? Is it out of date? Help you start to plan that hardware lifecycle for your clients. I mean, if you're an MSP doing an assessment and you see, hey, look, this device is out of support, I have revenue opportunities in front of me.
Exactly the first thing that my mind jumped to there. And I'm also intrigued. So you've got the device contract information. How do you pull that sort of warranty coverage and the contract coverage there?
Yes, so this comes primarily through vendor and third-party APIs where we query that information to see if it's available. In this case, would I be able to tell you who has the current contract? No, if it's not you, but if it's you and you can see it's expired, that's definitely a bit of a challenge that you'll need to resolve.
Yeah, and we're jumping ahead a little bit, so forgive me, but my mind is immediately going to, is all this information reportable? Is it something we can pull out as a report to say, hey, here's all the opportunities on this site for upgrades and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have this information at sort of to pick on that hardware lifecycle, but most of the information we talk about, I can look at a site level. So I can look at all the details for this site for all devices. I can look at this from a global level to show me all my locations and all my devices. I can also pull this information out through some integrations. So it's available with some of our integrations into PSA platforms, as well as via API as well. So as we start to release, as new things come down, it's sort of an API is a first-class citizen, if you will. And so as we release things for the UI, it gets into the APIs as well.
Got it.
So a lot of information here that's useful both from an inventory and a documentation. It's that, know what's on your network, know what I need to protect, know what is out there, but it's also super useful for troubleshooting. If I'm having issues and I'm trying to figure out, what devices are under support or what's out of support, I can start to see some of that information here as well. Just drilling down, we talk about some of the metrics that we start to monitor and how we can do performance monitoring. So out of the box, we're already managing and monitoring that performance on the devices. So this is primarily data that's being collected over SNMP, but we also will leverage command lines or APIs to pull in this information. Again, with Auvik, the data source doesn't matter, right? It's once we identify that device, we're going to use our logic that we've built in to apply the right monitoring to the right device.
Yeah.
So a lot of visibility here, and all the way down to every individual interface as well. So if I want to dive into specific interface statistics, all that's here without diving through each specific graph. All right. So let's, I guess, think about before we dive too much deeper into the device dashboard here. Let's think about that troubleshooting scenario a little bit and how we would sort of walk through that. I talked earlier about finding a device on the map here, figuring out exactly how they're connected back in, tracking up specific devices that they're connected into. So as I work through this process, I'm going to be able to dive into every single network device along the way to help identify if there's something like a traffic bottleneck. If someone's saying, "Hey, the internet's slow," I'll be able to see that. And an obvious question that comes up through that process is, if the network is slow, if the device bandwidth is super high, we start to ask the question, well, why is it slow? What's causing that? What's going on? Who's using all that bandwidth? So with that, we actually have our traffic insights component, which I'll launch right here, which actually gives me visibility into not just how much traffic is crossing the network, but then what is that traffic? Who's doing it? What are they doing? So here we're looking at traffic insights within one specific network, and I can start to drill down within a specific period of time to see what types of traffic is happening. Here, there's
and I can see things like file transfer, backup, and things like that on there. So yeah, because my mind immediately as an MSP jumps to which services are sort of gobbling up the bandwidth at that point.
Yeah, so it's what services are gobbling up the bandwidth. Am I doing, say, Windows updates or Apple software updates during business hours that maybe, we shouldn't be? One of my favorite ones you picked on file transfer, and I don't know whether there'll be any today, is I'll often see things like Dropbox in this file transfer. And it's like, well, hey, we don't use Dropbox. We should be using, Google Drive to share the documents, or, Microsoft to share the documents. So be able to get visibility into what those actual applications are.
Got it.
So a lot of useful troubleshooting information here to help me identify, not just how much traffic is traversing the network, but who is it? What are they doing? Where are they going? Is it business critical? Is it not? So we'll be able to do a deep dive into that traffic here as well.
Sure. The question that springs to mind here, obviously, we've got a couple of networks on display here. The one you cooked earlier, and then we've got like the Richard Tubb demo network. They're both, a reasonable amount of devices, but my question would be, how far can this scale? So I know some people are going to be watching this. They've got hundreds of endpoints, others have got thousands, others have got tens of thousands across there. How far does this scale?
So we have partners that range from, the tens of endpoints to literally the tens of thousands of endpoints. So it all depends on how you want to go about, deploying Auvik. We talked earlier about having that site model where we have individual locations. So, I don't have a limit on the number of sites an individual partner can have. So as an MSP, it fits well into, your practice where you have different sites for every single client, but you can scale an individual site up to 1,000 plus devices. So we're able to do 1,000 plus devices within every topology map times however many sites you want to have in there. There's definitely a lot of opportunity for growth, and one of the advantages to being a cloud-based software is we scale that up, and that's our problem. You don't have to worry about managing databases, adding another server. All you got to do is again deploy that collector, and we'll handle the rest of it.
And what does it? We already talked about it of it being multi-tenanted. What does it look like from a hierarchy perspective? Because that could get unwieldy really, really quickly. Can you give us a quick shove at how that looks?
For sure, yeah. So if we dive back up to this is our sort of top level, or what we often refer to as the root level dashboard, or the global dashboard, and this is where I start to do a lot of my site management. And we'll dive into a few more things as we go through here, like some of the inventory views and alerting views. But this basically allows me to control everything across my Auvik deployment, right? So if I want to do things like manage alerts or look at the traffic insight data, I can do that from this dashboard across all different sites. But I can also then drill down into individual ones. So here I would just see a listing of all my sites, but I'm able to sort and filter and search. And here I can map these all. I can set up integrations into other platforms and map them all back to my PSA. So I have it all linked together as well.
Loving the map above, by the way. That looks very cool. The actual the global map there showing. I can see lots of MSPs. They're going to use that as an easier way. They know where the client is or know where the site is. Perhaps can't remember the client name. So
yeah. And we can custom. So you can see here a lot of these sites are orange, right? Basically telling me that there's alerts currently at these sites. But we can customize some of this to sort of say, only show me emergency alerts that come up. So we'll have those, here it's orange. We can have them pop red or whatever color you want to sort of highlight, hey, there's a problem here.
Yeah, cool. All right, that makes sense. That makes it a lot easier for MSPs to actually drill down to the site they need to be at.
Yeah. So I just came back to the site that we had deployed earlier, just to sort of see where we're at, and we're starting to see some things come together that I'll want to highlight here. First is that we're starting to see some blue wires. So if we look at one of these connections, I can see that port 1048 on a switch is connected into my office access point. If we look down at the firewall, I have SNMP on that device. Oh, but I need to add in login credentials. So one of these discovery banners across the top, as we were talking about earlier, was saying, hey, now I need some credentials for this device. Go ahead and add them in. But I'm already starting to do performance monitoring on this firewall. So I'm already starting to see how it's performing over time. You can see the memory is pretty exhausted there. Maybe it's just a function of how the Sophos devices run. But we're starting to see some things come together with the different switches on my network. A QNAP here, a couple of access points. I have my ESX host, my hypervisor that's been discovered. I've tied into it via this VMware API and starting to get visibility into what devices are running on here. So it's using the credentials that we did provide for this. If I dive down into this discovery and manage credentials here, we see that I can see public was used on a couple of devices, but then I had this other community string that was used. So I'm able to check in and just see how that deployment's going here, but it's going pretty well overall.
Yeah. And for the benefit of people watching this, and they'll say, oh, this is a demo, this has been set up to go really fast. I've seen this sort of thing a couple of times. So this is legit, isn't it? This is, the ease of deployment is one thing, but the speed that Auvik actually goes out and collects this data, that's legit, isn't it?
This is legit. The only thing that I've done beforehand is I added credentials, and then you saw us do the collective deployment. I just didn't want to be typing out my credentials as everyone was watching here.
It would make for a really boring demo, but yeah. But anybody watching this, genuinely, this is one of the differentiators of Auvik is the speed that it goes at.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive back into that fully completed site that we were looking at earlier, where we have. Oh, I picked the wrong one. Let's just go through the hierarchy here, just to sort of show, hey, if I pick the wrong site.
It is a live demo and stuff goes wrong, right?
It is a live demo, yeah.
Is anybody thinking this is too fluid, this is too polished?
There's got to be one thing that goes wrong every demo. It's like it's a guarantee. So as we dive back into the site, we talked a little bit about that troubleshooting process, diving down to traffic insights, seeing what that traffic profile looks like. Another question that often comes up when I'm troubleshooting is I'll often get the complaint of, hey, it worked yesterday and it doesn't work today, or it worked this morning and not this afternoon. So my mind always goes to what changed, what happened on the network. And so I want to just pop in for a second to the configuration backups, because we alluded to this a little bit earlier, where we're automatically backing up network device configurations. And here, as we dive in, we can see that I have a full version history of all these device configs. So I can easily go back in time and figure out, what changed, what did it look like yesterday, what does it look like today? And we're automatically doing this. There's nothing that the user needs to do. Once you provide credentials to Auvik, it's automatically going to back up these devices and start to manage these configurations.
This is a real lifesaver here as well, can't it? For somebody who's gone and made some changes on a firewall, and then what changes did I make? Did I make the changes? Did you make the changes? What's going on here? Just the ability to roll back, really, really good.
Right, the ability to roll back and the ability to see what's actually changed. So not having to guess, right? Seeing it side by side, saying, hey, here's the two different configurations. Here's the exact lines that are different. Looks like someone here changed the encryption algorithms for this IPsec tunnel. So I now know exactly what changed. Could that have affected my user? Maybe. So maybe this is the cause of the problem. But if not, I need to sort of dive back.
And I know some Auvik MSPs who cite this as worth the price of admission alone. This is how they've got them out of pickles.
Yeah. I was doing a deployment very early on. I've been with Auvik for a number of years, and I want to say this was 4 years ago now, or maybe even 5 years ago. And when I showed him this, and it was actually his switch that we had backed up, and the expression on his face was just like, oh, because he told me the story the day before. He had literally spent 4 hours rebuilding the configuration because the switch had died. And I was like, yeah, that's painful. Like he felt the pain the day before, so it was right there and sort of right present in his mind.
Exactly. Yeah. For any MSP watching this, the backup is only as good as the restore. We've all been in that situation, so this is a very cool feature.
Yeah, for sure. So being able to come in and either do direct restore for previous configurations that are here, or if it's something that you need to RMA a device and you have a brand new something sitting on your desk you're trying to prepare, I can export the config from here, import to the device, and then ship it off to the site. However you want to manage that workflow.
Yeah, makes sense. So you were about to show us something else there, but I'm intrigued. Is there anything else on the dashboard that we've not covered yet? Because I feel like there was more to see there.
So there's a few different spots that we can dive around back into. One area that we haven't gone into yet is the remote management. So say, for example, I now need to make a change. I've determined, hey, this configuration change was done in error, but I don't just want to roll back. Maybe I need to make another change to sort of roll forward. We can start to access these devices remotely, sitting from this same console, same browser session, not having to do a truck roll or run on site. I can easily jump directly into the device. Now I have a live command line on it without having to track down passwords. And it's using, my credentials. So it's using Steve's credentials to say, hey, are you okay to access this device? Yes, you are. And then Auvik will pass on the device credentials to the device itself. So just get out of there so we don't make any changes. And of course, if we expand that troubleshooting scenario a little bit to also cover a little bit of logs. So one thing that will often come up is, the logs don't lie. And at the end of the day, if you haven't gotten to the root cause by looking at the traffic patterns, looking at configuration changes, sometimes we ultimately have to go into logs. Mm-hmm. And so with Auvik, we actually act as a syslog server as well, and we'll automatically back up or will automatically sort of collect syslog devices or syslogs that are thrown at our collector. So we can navigate this. Here I'm just looking at a specific device over the last few minutes. But say I'm trying to troubleshoot a problem that happened yesterday at 5 p.m. or whatever time that was. I can actually look at all the logs across all my devices for that period of time and narrow in on a specific window. So it's going to be 2 demo fails. And this one is
not to worry. It wouldn't be a live demo unless we did this. So
yeah. So here we go, as everything sort of pops up here. We're looking at the device logs here the last 10 minutes. There's over 7,000 entries. I know I don't want to look through 7,000 entries. So as an example, if I'm looking for a specific needle in the haystack, or I'm looking at a specific time window, I can narrow in on specific seconds. So rather than looking at, the past 10 minutes, if I want to look at, literally a minute worth of data or, a couple seconds worth of data, we can start to narrow in on that specific time frame. And then as well, start to slice and dice it by specific devices or specific error messages to really help me find that needle in the haystack quickly.
And we talked about, at the moment, we've showed lots of wired devices, network switches and routers and things like that, but you've just had a ruckus access point there. So this is not just for wired devices, just to be really clear about this. This is any IP-enabled device, wireless, wired, or anything in between.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, a lot of that glue that holds the network together, like the switches, the routers, the access points, those are all going to be wired. But then we're going to see everything that's wirelessly connected into that as well. Or if you have point-to-point links, we'll be able to cross that point-to-point link and see devices on the other side. You're right. Anything with an IP address, we're able to discover and we're able to manage.
And how far does the discovery go? This might seem like a really, really silly question, but is there a way of saying, only go so far, but don't go any further? Or is there a chance if you don't configure it properly, it'll just keep going?
So, complicated question. We have had people discover the internet before because it is possible. We do put up warnings in place saying, "Hey, are you sure you want to do this?" But basically, we enable our partners to scan any number of networks that they want, as large of networks as they want. So here we have 51 different networks that Auvik has discovered. So by talking to different devices, by asking them, "Hey, what are your routes? What are your IP addresses?" We've discovered all these different subnets. And through here, we basically give the users the ability to come in and select to either scan a network or not scan a network. And so I can, if we look at some here down below, our sets don't scan some of these public subnets, but I could easily come out and set these to scan as well and have these discover additional networks. There's no limit to the number of subnets or networks that we can scan, as long as a collector can reach them. And even on that note, it's not one collector, one site, right? If I have different locations that I want to all manage into the same map, or I have two segments of the network, like say a guest wireless and a more sensitive network, and I want them both to appear in the same map, but they can't talk to each other, I can put a collector on each one of those subnets and have each collector report back up into the same Auvik site. So we really, there's a number of different decisions you can make. The possibilities, I don't want to say are unlimited, but there's definitely a lot of options there.
There's a lot of flexibility there. And can I ask about, obviously, the majority of people watching this now are managing remote networks, where sort of a couple of years ago, pre-COVID-19 pandemic, not so much. But,
Yep.
To what degree can we manage home users down VPN tunnels and things like that?
So we're going to see users that are connecting back into that office network through our VPN session in use here. It looks like I'm looking at a timeline for only a minute, so I'm not going to get anyone over the past minute. But if I go back, a little bit of time, I'm going to start to see different users connected into the VPN over time, so I can see how they're connecting back in. I can discover and monitor them if we set those up as managed subnets. So if you have a specific subnet range that your VPN users are getting an IP on, I could go reach out and discover those assets. For the most part, we are looking more at the network with the managed network equipment, right? The end user firewall or the end user router from their ISP doesn't necessarily have SNMP and those other things that we're looking to get.
Yeah. Will it show up the consumer grade equipment there? So I'm thinking some smaller MSPs. I used to be an MSP, Steve. So I know that whilst in my mind, I would love us to have business grade equipment at all of our client sites, that's not actually the case in the real world. So how does Auvik deal with consumer grade equipment, perhaps unmanaged switches and things like that?
Yeah, so any device that has an IP address we're going to discover, right? So it doesn't matter whether I get SNMP on it or not, I'm going to be able to discover that asset. And if you say, hey, this device, it's a off-the-shelf kind of router that has an IP address, we can still monitor that for up-down status. And we're going to start to see devices connected in through it. And you'll see assets that start to look like this on the map, where you see these, what we call inferred switches. So we have a physical port on a switch that is connected into multiple devices. We know you can't just split an Ethernet cable, right? So our map starts to infer that there must be a switch connected down in here. So we're going to start to discover some of these unmanaged switches that will allow you to sort of get visibility that these devices are out there, even if they can't be fully managed.
That is very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So where are we going from here? We talked a little bit about the topology map and some of the troubleshooting scenarios. Now, obviously, we don't always want to be in a reactive state, right? Sometimes we want to be, all the time, we want to be in front of the curve. my position is that we're never going to be 100% proactive, right? We should always work towards that milestone, but we're never going to be 100%. But one common thing that comes up with most network management platforms is alert management, right? And how do I get notified about things going wrong before they actually go wrong?
Yeah. And can I ask a question at this point, Steve? Because for the managed service providers watching this, I think it's fairly apparent at the moment that this is a sort of RMM tool, remote monitoring and management, but it's also not. How would you differentiate between some MSPs who have already got an RMM tool and what Auvik does?
Right, so they both have their place, right? They, both in an initial assessment and onboarding, as well as sort of that ongoing monitoring and management. So Auvik's focus is on the network infrastructure, on that glue, on the routers, on the switches, on the firewalls. Some RMMs will discover those devices, but they're not doing that in-depth monitoring of them, nor are they providing detailed topology maps. And so where we're really strong is giving you that full context of how all the endpoints are connected back into the network. So, you know, I focus a lot on troubleshooting, because I think that's one of the areas that comes up a lot. And it's, you know, I'm going to help troubleshoot the network, but once we get down to the endpoint, like, you know, actually it's one application on this endpoint that's causing the problem. That's when I use the other tool in my tool belt, right? That's when I use the RMM to help me troubleshoot that. So they work together.
That absolutely makes sense. Yeah. So you were going to show us some of the sort of proactive way you can use Auvik here.
Yeah, you bet. So we do have a lot of alerts that come pre-configured out of the box. And this is another one that we talked earlier about, the out of the box experience and how, you know, that quick time to value. And so this is another area where we start to show that as well. So things like, you know, simple, hey, your internet connection is lost, something that's, you know, going to come out of the box. But also low-level changes like spanning tree changes, not something that a lot of MSPs I think today are monitoring for spanning tree changes in the network. Anytime that this alert does trigger and you didn't make a change to the network, you should be going, you know, why is that happening? There's also a number of other more performance-related alerts like high CPU utilization or high interface utilization. And all these alerts are pre-configured, so you don't have to come in here and tell Auvik to monitor interface utilization. That's already happening. So if we go back to that site that we had deployed earlier, as a quick example, all of these interfaces I'm already monitoring. All the alerts for these are already set up. This has already happened. It's, you know, I'm not, no demo magic behind the scenes. This is, you know, what comes out of the box. But if you want to make changes, you know, we have our default trigger condition here for interface utilization at 80% as an example. Say that's, you know, not high enough for me. I can spin that up to 90% and have that apply now to every single interface. Or we talked earlier about having that sort of having that global dashboard. I can make this change at the global dashboard and have it apply to all my sites. So it's really about reducing the time it takes to manage it.
And how granular can you get with these alerts? Let's say, and again, I'm just trying to think of an unideal situation, Steve, but a real world one. You've got a client who has got a rather old piece of network equipment there. It needs replacing, but the alerts are coming up again and again, you know, sure. And you want to say to it, right, okay, can we set it at a device level to say, look, we know it's constantly running at 90% CPU. We don't really need to know about it.
Yeah, so I can apply an alert just to a specific device, and just to sort of run through this quickly. We use English language expressions to help get these alerts across. I don't have to track down, you know, OIDs or specific MIBs. I can just say, hey, I want to monitor CPU utilization on this device, and let me know when it's greater than 95% as an example. And you know, here I've basically set this up. I can select a notification channel, have that sent to ConnectWise as an example, or into ServiceNow or Slack or whatever other system I'm using. But you know, here we are. You know, a minute later, I basically have that alert set up for this switch.
Fantastic. And we're jumping around a bit. Forgive me, Steve. You know, I get shiny objects, and I'm like, oh, let's have a look at that. Integrations. You've already mentioned some of them there. I can see Microsoft Teams. I can see Slack. Most MSPs use that. In terms of third-party tools and PSA tools, Autotask, ConnectWise, what other integrations can we expect?
Yeah, so our integrations come in a few different flavors. I would say the first bucket of integrations is around the inventory, or getting visibility into all the assets that we've discovered. Yeah. So coming up to the top level here, there's a couple of, you know, native integrations that we've built with ConnectWise and Autotask that allow us to sync our inventory into these platforms as, ConnectWise configurations, the term they use, which super confusing when I talk about network device configurations all the time.
But we'll bear with it.
We'll bear with it. Yeah, I can't change that. I can't change the naming convention. So,
and what does that? If I can ask a question, what does that look like in terms of? Is it a two-way sync there? If we make changes in ConnectWise, does it reflect in Auvik and vice versa?
So with things like the inventory, it is a push to that platform. And so here we're going to take all these devices that we've discovered. You get to configure how you want the devices to sync over, like what information. So as an example, host name, IP address, MAC address, but I can also come in and customize what information I want to sync over. Similarly, we have a number of integrations built with our APIs for platforms like IT Glue and IT Boost and Passportal Docs and all these other tools that allow you to pull this inventory out of our system and into that documentation platform. So that's the first bucket. The second is really around alerts. So we were just talking about alerts, but it's how do I want to consume those alerts? And ultimately, that decision is up to our partners. If you want an email, we can send it to email. If you want it to go into Microsoft Teams or into Slack, cool. Into your PSA, these are where we start to have those better two-way integrations, right? So you can start to react to tickets within your PSA platform, assign them to different, a ticket comes in, you can assign it to a different service board. We keep track of all those connections and all those links. Ultimately, when the ticket is closed off in the PSA, the alert can be closed off from our end. Or if the problem comes up and then goes away, we'll close that ticket in the PSA as well. So you don't have to worry about just a bunch of noise inside the platform.
No worries. Go ahead, Steve. There was something I want to ask you that I'm burning to ask you, but I can feel that you've got something else you want to share first.
There was one more bucket of integrations, and that's just into the RMM platforms. So with a couple of platforms like Automate and Command, we're able to integrate our Auvik dashboard into that RMM dashboard. So we talked earlier about how useful it is troubleshooting. Sometimes I need both systems. Having that single dashboard, that single pane of glass is one less click for some of the L1 techs, which is super useful for a lot of our partners.
That makes total sense. And you preempted my question there. So I should learn. You've got the answers to this. I don't need to prompt you for it.
Yeah.
Something else I want to ask though, we touched upon it earlier, the reporting side of things. So a lot of information can be viewed in a lot of different ways. Can we jump a little bit deeper into the reporting side of things and what that might look like? And when we talk about integrations, is there perhaps any way to push these reports out into other tools that we can use to manipulate the info?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say there's a few different levels of reporting that it depends on what end result you're looking for. Is it a client-facing report? Is it something for your internal knowledge? Is it something that is an Auvik network-only report, or are you looking to integrate with other systems as well? So there's a few different areas that we have inside the platform where I can come in and look at high-level reports where we're basically summarizing dashboards across our system within one dashboard. So if I'm looking for, say, the utilization of all my network devices across the network, I can come into the Auvik dashboard and I can see that kind of information here. But sometimes that isn't enough, right? Sometimes I want more than just Auvik information in a report. I want to combine it with something else. So with that, we have a number of APIs that we've built that allow us to integrate into other platforms. This is an example is Power BI, where we're actually starting to pre-build dashboards to help you get visibility into things like inventory and performance management. Right. And let's just do a quick check to see if that's going to. Doesn't look like I got that finished setting up. So we have these pre-built templates that Auvik has put together, shared with the community. They're free and available for download. We have a ton of partners using these today. They basically allow me to come in and report on, how has my NOC been performing over the past month? How sort of prepare that QBR dashboard for a client? What is the uptime? How's the inventory changed? How many outages have we had? How many alerts have we responded to? I would say, give some visualization to all the things that you're doing behind the scenes. Something like resolved alerts is something that I think is very useful for a lot of our partners, where sometimes there's a question of hey, if it's not broken, what value are you providing? I think that's a kind of a conversation we're always having.
Yeah, all too often, and I'll say this for everybody watching this demo, if you do manage services well, and I used to run an MSP company, you swoop in, you solve people's pain, and they're like, brilliant, you're the hero, Steve, thank you. Then 6 months later, when they get no pain, they're like, what is it we're paying you for? So the reason I was so intrigued on the reporting side of things is you are showing the stuff behind the scenes that breaks, because we know this stuff isn't set and forget. And you are saying, look, here's the work we're doing to keep things running smoothly for us. That's what you're paying us for.
Right, exactly. Here's all the work we're doing, and it allows you to. There's also the sort of drill into this one section. There's an area that can start to highlight some maybe at-risk inventory. So it allows you to start that conversation as well. We talked about that hardware life cycle and exposing things that are expired warranty coverage or need firmware updates. So it allows you to have that conversation on maybe increased budget for new equipment based on data rather than based on just opinions or feelings. So
yeah, managed by metrics, not gut feelings. So.
Yep, exactly. One other thing, I know we kind of dived into the report, but one question that often comes up that I do just want to touch on quickly. We talked about customizing the alerts a little bit. I'll often get the question of, hey, it's great that Auvik does this out of the box, but I have some really unique gear, or I have something that is like, I want to monitor this, thing that, someone's never heard of before. So I'll often get the question of, well, can I do that with Auvik? And I just want to sort of walk through that quick use case where we can talk about, hey, we do set up these, what we call our custom monitor settings. So if there's some metric that you see here, like we've talked a lot about interface utilization and CPU usage, let's say there's something out there that we've never, that we haven't monitored before, and it's something that you want to set up. We can do that from within our dashboard as well. So I just came back into this lab network we set up. And as you can see, the network is pretty well all put together now. We have a firewall up at the top. It's actually a virtual firewall, so it's running on my hypervisor here, connected into my switch. So this is a pretty accurate map showing me how everything's connected, where my QNAP's connected into my network here. So pretty good overall.
Petryschuk network is pretty sweet, I've got to say.
I've seen better home networks. Just before we jumped on the recording, Richard and I were talking about one of my colleagues who is into the old school computing. So he's got Ataris all over the place. Now his network is something to be. Yeah.
I can well imagine. Yes.
Yeah. So say, for example, I wanted to monitor, I mentioned my QNAP. If I wanted to monitor something like, temperature on my QNAP, I can come in and quickly add a monitor setting. And this is the one time I need to start to dive into OIDs and figure out what everything is. But I can come in here and just add a specific OID in, and I can, tell it to only apply to my network storage devices. If I type it in properly here. And now we're going to start to go out and monitor this specific device, this specific OID, and I can now build alerts based on this. So adding in your own OIDs, your own things to monitor is pretty simple, and then we can build alerts on those as well.
Okay, that's very cool. Yeah.
A lot of flexibility.
What's the I was going to say the craziest thing that you've seen monitored there, but what's the strangest thing that you've seen monitored on our client network so far?
I don't know whether I have a good example for that. I think they're all fairly normal.
We've got to be really careful about how we say this as well, because somebody's going to say, I monitor the temperature on such and such, and I don't think that's weird.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that's weird. Yeah. We see a lot of people use these for more unique devices that rather than unique monitors. Maybe it's the device doesn't support any of the standard MIBs. It's something that is reported on in a weird way. So I would say it's more unique devices rather than a unique metric, because mostly it's similar things. We want to know how it's performing. We want to know how the hardware is. Is the hardware healthy? Do I have power supplies failing or fans failing and all those kind of things? So it's all fairly standard.
Makes sense.
Great. So I think we're sort of nearing the end in terms of the functionality to uncover. Were there any other questions that you wanted to dive into?
Absolutely. So I think if we could give maybe an individual example of how somebody might use this in the real world. So let's just say somebody gets in touch with you, or a real common one for MSPs. The internet is running slow. Perhaps we can dive into that. I know you showed us a little bit of it, but run us through from start to finish. Somebody gets in touch, raises a ticket, the internet's running slow. What we normally do as MSPs is, where do we start?
Yeah.
Talk through that scenario.
So I'll first say, and I don't have it brought up to show, we have built out a few standard operating procedures for this internet slow, as well as a couple of other examples that they're not Auvik specific, although obviously you can use Auvik as part of the solution. But if you feel like your process around, troubleshooting internet is slow kind of problem, could be improved, check out those SOPs. They're in our partner portal, or if you're an Auvik partner already, you can reach out to your customer success manager, and they can share those with you, because it highlights what tools within the Auvik platform you can use there, as well as what other things you can do when you're troubleshooting those. Like, the first thing I would say from a troubleshooting point of view is, if someone tells me the internet's slow, I'm not diving into my tools first. I'm asking a couple questions. Hey, is it just you or your neighbor as well? Or depending on the context, collect a little bit more information. But to talk about the tools, here we have our internet connection check, which is one thing that we hadn't touched on earlier, which is probably the first spot I'm going to check for that troubleshooting scenario. Is it something internal to the network, or is it external? And this is going to tell me whether it's something ISP related. So I can see over time whether packets are being lost on this, how long it's taking for those round trip replies to come in. And I'll be able to tell here everything's pretty normal. I don't see a high round trip time. It's probably not external to the network, it's something internal. And that's when I'm going to start to dive into that workflow we were talking about earlier, diving into device dashboards, checking out the performance metrics, looking at that traffic insights view to see what applications are consuming the bandwidth, if it is a bandwidth related issue, and then diving down into things like, has the configuration changed, diving into the syslog, all sort of within this same dashboard.
Yeah, I get the feeling there is more to see on traffic insights as well. Can we go back and just have a look at some of the other bits and pieces that we can see there, because it looks like a really rich area for information?
Yeah, you bet. So we sort of talked about the troubleshooting use case of, looking at a spike and diving down into, what applications were consuming bandwidth during that spike. Let me open up another window here just for a quick second. I think it's a little bit more interesting traffic. So we're not just looking at the lab traffic. So I'm just opening that up here now.
And kudos here, Steve. I put you on the spot all the time in, I was going to say all the time in podcast video demos. You've never been phased once with anything I've ever asked you. So,
yep. It's easier, Richard, when you love what you do and you live what you work, right? So these are tools I actually use on a regular basis to, mostly in this case, my home lab. It's to frame my wife for being on Facebook all day or something, but don't tell her that. This is now recorded. So
just between you and I.
Between you and I and the rest of the world here. Diving into this network, we talked about that, looking at a spike use case. So we can see during the business day yesterday how traffic sort of progressed through the network throughout that business day. Lower spikes around, there are not really any spikes around this lunch hour. We can see other times throughout the day things are going on. And I can start to drill into these specific categories to really understand what type of traffic it is. Here there's Netflix on my network and some YouTube on my network. And I'm able to see that. There's also the use case of just sort of trying to figure out what applications are in use. And so looking at that social media view to see, who's using Facebook. And by clicking on one of these applications, I can then pivot on that into this top end view to understand who that actually is. So not just, hey, there was Facebook, but here we can look at specific devices. Devices or device names. Here, the device name is actually just a generic name, but we can see there's something like this desktop device. So device name desktop was accessing Facebook during a period of time. So I'm able to get that visibility.
Forgive me for jumping in, Steve. So where we've got generic names, I never asked you this question earlier, but can we actually go ahead and rename those devices in there to something more user-friendly? Yeah,
absolutely. So here, that would be... This was that specific device. So I could come in, looks like it's offline right now, but it's a Motorola Mobility. So it's a cell phone of some kind. So I could come in and quickly rename this device.
Thank you. Yeah.
To whatever it might be. And as that name is updated, we'll see this update. I think it's whether it's a minute or two, but it'll be updated here within the Traffic Insights dashboard as well. The other view that we get in here that's pretty useful, I'll often hear the question, where's my traffic going when it leaves the network? We often use it in context of a country we're not too keen on or familiar with. I'm going to pick on someone a little bit more neutral and say, maybe I want to see all the traffic coming and going from France. So not to pick on any specific other country, but now I can look at all the traffic going to and from France in terms of the specific users as well as the specific applications. So here there's some encrypted traffic. Unfortunately, we're not able to see inside everything. We classify what we can, but here there's some encrypted traffic. And if I pivot back to that top end view, it looks like it's that same device that's chatting with something in France here.
Yeah. And I know somebody who's used Auvik in this situation and had quite a few, shall we say, lower quality IP cameras, sort of cheap and cheerful there. And they were shocked at the amount of traffic that was going back to certain locations in the world when they'd never given permission for that. That's all I'll say about that story.
Yeah, it's again, as we talked earlier about the map and how a lot of people will use the map and say, I didn't know that was on the network. A lot of people will start to use this traffic insights view to say, whoa, I didn't know that type of traffic was happening on my network, right? It's amazing what it uncovers, especially when you're looking at things that you didn't think were running at a specific time, but hey, they're still pulling down data. They're still, they're still operating. Hey, I wasn't on Facebook, but all of a sudden Facebook, to pick on a bad example, is pulling down data throughout the day, right?
Yeah.
I was only on it for 5 minutes this morning. So,
yeah. And let me ask the question here, because lots of people watching this will be thinking, okay, where I'm located in the world, we've got certain legislation, certain compliance around where data is stored. So tell me about what type of data is stored, where in the world it is stored, and how that all fits into MSPs that perhaps are looking at GDPR compliance and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. So Auvik has data centers around the world. So between North America, we have a couple in the EU, down in ANZ as well. And so we keep data local to the geography that you pick when you sign up with Auvik. So as you sign up, you get to pick a region, and we keep the data best effort within that geography. Now, at any time, if you need to change it, you let us know. Say, hey, I don't know when this would happen, but I used to be in the US and now I'm in Europe. I don't think that would happen, but we can change it if you request, but we generally keep it within that geography. Now, in terms of what types of data is collected, I know there's a lot of concerns about things like personal information, and anytime we're tracking any usage like this, there's that kind of concern. And remember that we're not seeing inside the traffic, right? The traffic insights isn't something that sits in line and is breaking open TLS traffic. So it's not like we're looking at banking details. We're not pulling down usernames and passwords and those kind of things. It is based on net flow data and looking at metadata around that. So the extent of the kind of personal information that we're collecting is IP addresses, which again is contained within that specific geography where you select when you sign up, and so it's not generally leaving that region.
Got it.
Yeah, and again, not diving into the traffic, so it's pretty secure. Of course, in terms of how the data is actually secured, we do follow industry standard best practices. We do have a security white paper. I won't regurgitate that here, but the information's all there, and we keep it pretty out in the open. So if you have any questions on it, you can definitely reach out.
And along the lines of security as well, so we've already had a look at the granularity of sites, devices, things like that. When it comes to end users, so me as an MSP, my service desk, members within my team, how much granularity is there to the sites they can access, the type of information they can get, reporting, things like that, Steve?
Yeah, user management's a big thing. So we, I'll say first off, we enable you to integrate with your existing SSO providers. So if you have, whether it's sort of one of the bigger ones like Okta or OneLogin. I shouldn't have started naming names, but
yes.
And basically anything that supports SAML we can integrate with to allow you to authenticate to the Auvik platform. Then when it comes to management of what sites you can access, we actually enable like a very granular per site kind of permission set. So if maybe the business owner might only have like a financial view, they don't necessarily need to see all the technical details.
That's exactly what I was thinking of. Yes.
Yeah. Or like the service desk manager will have full access to everything, and that kind of thing. So we are able to be fairly granular here and break down the different permissions. on a per site basis.
Got it. How about if, we talked about scenarios, perhaps I used to refer to it as downstream IT, where there's an internal IT team. They work with a managed service provider who's got Auvik, and we can do all these whiz-bang things. And they're like, this is really cool. Can we have access to it? Is there any granularity about how you can delegate access to other people in other parts of the client's business?
Yeah, you bet. Then it just comes down to how or where I want to share it, right? So I can invite individual users for a specific location. They're, as we're sort of that multi-tenanted kind of view, they're only going to see the information that they need to for their specific location. They're not going to sort of cross-pollinate to anything else.
Got it. That makes absolute sense. You've answered just about every question I've thrown at you. I'm going to throw one at you there that might boggle your mind. Is there anything that, if you were me, I should have already asked you and I haven't?
I think, one obvious one is, hey, I like what I've seen here. I want to get started, or I want to take it for a trial spin. There might be other more tactical or product related questions, but I will just sort of pull back here and I'm happy to sort of answer other questions you have. But if there's something that you are interested in doing, if you are watching this right now and want to take it for a trial, we do have a free trial available, 14 days, auvik.com/Tubb, easy to remember.
I love it.
But there's a ton of product questions that I get all the time. The types of questions I get range anywhere from, deployment to ongoing troubleshooting to, business agreements, pricing stuff. I really want to keep today technical focused, but if you do have any other questions, you can get in touch with our team for sure.
And what type of MSPs, what type of IT companies are you seeing use Auvik at the moment? Is there a type of, culture? Is there a size? Who's using Auvik out there?
I would say it's across the board. We have partners that range from 1 to 2 small shops just starting to mature their business, all the way up to organizations with hundreds of users that are, or hundreds of technicians that are using Auvik. So it does depend. I wouldn't say that there's a one size fits all. Where we sort of fit in is where you're managing networks anywhere from a few dozen endpoints up to a few thousand endpoints, right? Not looking at organizations that are hundreds of thousands of users, but it's sort of that small to mid-size where a lot of MSPs end up playing.
Yeah, and I'll give a shout out for Auvik as a company here. You are doing wonderful things. You've got the Frankly IT podcast. You've been a guest on my own podcast, Steve. And we'll include all of this in the show notes below the video as well, so that people can go and check it out. But if anybody wants to follow up with you specifically, you've got a fan club building here, Steve. I speak to people in the MSP industry. If anybody wants to reach out to you directly to continue the conversation, how would they do that?
So the easiest way, my email address is probably the easiest to remember. It's steve@auvik.com. I was early enough that I got the Steve at Auvik, so I'm happy about that.
Steve at Auvik, yeah.
Yeah. There are 4 of us now, but I'm still steve@auvik.com.
Wonderful, Steve. Well, as I said, we'll include all of the details in the show notes. This has been a blast. Thank you. When we did the podcast a few weeks ago, which I highly encourage everybody to go and listen to, we covered a whole lot more about this whole genre and what it means for managed service providers and IT solution providers. But I really appreciate you coming here and just giving us a deep dive into it. I think it's apparent to everybody, no matter what question I throw at Steve Petryshuck, the man can just answer anything.
Thanks so much, Richard. It's always great speaking with you. And, I could probably talk about Auvik all day. So always appreciate the chance to get out and share a little bit with the community.
Well, maybe we'll have to have a follow-up video. If you've got any feedback at all, any questions you want to ask Steve, by all means, reach out to him or leave a comment in the comments below. And perhaps we'll do a follow-up video soon with some of those questions.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Steve.